All right. So tonight we're going to finish this study that I've called Mad Hatters, and we've been taking a look at some of the different characters that are in First and Second Samuel, and each of these characters have certain parallel characteristics to political leaders, even in our own day and age. And I think it's appropriate that we're going to finish tonight talking about a character by the name of Joab, who is related to King David, but he more importantly is an important military figure for David. And we're going to learn a little bit about his approach to how he thinks David's kingdom should be governed. So, as we begin, I just want to remind you of this chart that we have been using. We began with Eli, talked a little bit about Saul, David, Absalom, and tonight, Joab, I am calling the ruthless commander. One of the things that we're going to see about Joab is that in interests of David's kingdom, he coldly kills Abner, Absalom, and Amasa. We'll get an introduction to who those individuals are as well. But the best thing to get a hold of with Joab is he's an individual that has David's interests at heart. And he's an individual that, while he is ruthless in many ways, he's an individual that was very loyal to David. Unfortunately, by the end of his story, we're going to see David wasn't quite as loyal to him. But in Second Samuel chapters 14 through 24, so you can see it's a pretty extensive amount of material. He plays a role in each of these chapters, or most of these chapters. And as he does so, he kind of sets the pace for what's going to come next in the kingdom. So Saul has been replaced by David, and David is going to be replaced eventually by Solomon, even though Solomon wasn't really the rightful heir to the throne in terms of being the next one in line. Joab, as I mentioned a moment ago, is a part of David's extended family. So when you read in First Samuel about the brothers of David that are marched before um, uh, the possibility of being the king, we are told that David is the last of the brothers. But it's not until you get to First Chronicles chapter 2 that we find that he has two sisters as well. And one of his sisters' name is Zariah, and she has three sons: Abishai, Joab, the middle son, and Asahel. And you can find that in First Chronicles chapter 2, 16. Joab is probably the younger brother of Abishai. He's probably the middle child, which makes David his uncle. And in David's early reign, Joab, even though he is younger than David, is old enough to command the respect of being the commander of David's army. And he's a loyal supporter. We're told that he is a part of the individuals in 1 Samuel 22, verse 1, that followed David. If you remember that verse, all kinds of people that were needy people followed David and joined him while David is in exile on the run from Saul. And he forms an army. We're told that there's 400 men that follow David and are the basis of his military. And Joab will become the leader of that group of men. Now, what I want to do tonight is I want to give to you just kind of a big 60,000 foot perspective on Joab for a few moments, just kind of mark some characteristics. And then I'm going to go to some individual stories where we'll see that. So there's a lot of movement in Second Samuel, And so I think it's better to kind of get the big picture first, and then we'll dive into a few stories. So the overview on Joab's life is this. I already mentioned that he's a commander of David's army. David is his uncle, and in many ways, he becomes kind of the military architect of Israel's survival on one hand. Uh, David and Saul have been at war with each other for a while. And then he is also the architect of David's kingdom expanding. Now, one of the things we'll know about Joab is he's very loyal to the throne, but we're going to see in the episode with Absalom that he's not always loyal to the king's heart, because David is going to ask very specifically that Joab treat Absalom tenderly, kindly. And Joab ignores that and ends up murdering Absalom. The core identity, if we could put our thumb on it, is he's an individual that does what needs to be done. He's kind of the individual that does what's necessary. He's always in fear of the collapse of David's kingdom. Therefore, he utilizes control. And I think I'm reading into this. I can't turn to a specific verse to show you this, but if I had to put words into Joab's mouth, I think he would say something like this: if I don't act, no one will, and everything's going to fall apart. So I think he's an individual that kind of sees everything kind of on his shoulders. He sees himself as kind of indispensable to the kingdom, but he also is very dangerous as well. And so he's an individual that has a lot of interesting traits. He is very loyal to David's kingdom. He honors David's authority. Uh, Sometimes he feels that the authority of David is not always efficient, and so he does what he needs to do because he's very pragmatic. He will choose results over relationships, and he sees mercy as expendable. In other words, well, no, we have to keep the kingdom forthright in our mind, and and he sees if putting something on hold or procrastinating on it, he sees that as weakness. So delay is weakness in his frame of mind, and he's always looking for what will work the best in the situation. Now, he's always asking what works, but if we flip the coin, we will find that he rarely asks, what does God desire? What would God want in this situation? So he's a very strong, poignant individual that David relies on heavily. But he's also an individual that will take matters into his own hands a little bit and will do even what David doesn't desire. And so, with that in mind, I guess you could say Joab, when he kills these three individuals, and we're going to look at these three episodes in a moment, he is an individual that is very guarded. He's an individual that I put emotionally armored. He's an individual that won't show his real feelings. He's an individual that is able to push mercy aside. Here's a picture of Absalom hanging in the oak tree, and Joab is about ready to thrust a spear through his heart. When David hears about Absalom's death, he is in full orb grief. I mean, he is just overwhelmed with grief that Absalom, who would have been the next in line to take the throne, he just is filled with heartache, and Joab sees that as a liability. Joab thinks that David's grief is embarrassing him as a king. that compassion is impractical and that showing tears can be a liability when you are the king. So we'll come to that in a moment. So here are his signature actions. He kills a guy by the name of Abner in chapter 3, Absalom in chapter 18. He will rebuke David for overly grieving for Absalom in chapter 19, and then he kills an individual by the name of Amasa in chapter 20. So there are three signature murders that Joab does, and his legacy, I would say, is that he always values results over people. He survival replaces any type of morality that he has, and control replaces trust. He's an individual that does what he wants to do, and it doesn't matter how much pain, how much um, trauma, how much tragedy it causes. He has one thing in mind. So, with that in mind, what I want to do is talk a little bit about Joab's role here. And as we do, we're going to interact with some of these different stories that I have just mentioned. So, we're going to first take a look at the fact that David has been in a long war with Saul. In 2 Samuel chapter 3, verse 1, it says, "There was a long war between the house of Saul and the house of David. David grew stronger and stronger, while the house of Saul became weaker and weaker." And so we already kind of know that David's going to win out in the end because Saul is on the decline. We see him expanding his territory, and he kills a lot of people in the process, and he collects a lot of spoil of war as well. And what we're told is that he is an individual that um, does what needs to be done. In the famous story of David and Bathsheba, when Bathsheba is pregnant, uh, it is David that tells Joab to put Uriah at the head of the lines where the fiercest and most skilled warriors on the other side are. And Uriah is going to be killed in battle in chapter 11 of 2 Samuel. Um, Joab is an individual that is, we're told, put in command of the army in chapter 8, verse 16. Now, that's interesting because we're told here in chapter 3, where we are, that at the very end of the chapter, one of the things that we see is that Joab is counted among the sons of Zeruiah as too violent for me. Here's what verse 39 says, 339. "Today I am powerless, even though anointed king. These men, the sons of Zeruiah, are too violent for me." And that includes Joab. So David is a bit cautious with Joab, and yet he places him in command of his army. And as a result of that, you can see here on the screen some of the things that Joab does. He defeats some Aramean mercenaries in chapter 10. He handles a siege against the Ammonites in chapter 11. He carries out the orders to kill Uriah in chapter 11. And he's going to break the defenses of another enemy by the name of Rabbah, and sends for David in chapter 12 to come and take credit for the victory, because that's the political move to make, is to make him stronger in his kingdom. So we're still in chapter 3, and the first signature move of Joab is to murder a guy by the name of Abner. So in verse 6, we're told in chapter 3 while there was a war between the house of Saul and the house of David, Abner was making himself strong in the house of Saul. So Abner is a part of Saul's military. He is an individual that Saul is trusting. But what we're going to find here in chapter 3 is Abner is going to approach David, and he is basically going to um, uh, go over to David's side. So, what we find here, beginning in verse 6 and following, it says um, in verse 7, now Saul had a concubine whose name was Rizpah, daughter of Aiah. And Ishbaal said to Abner, why have you gone in to my father's concubine? Well, in the ancient Near East, according to the usage of the day, a king's concubine was their royal property and must be kept within the royal household. And for him to sleep with this concubine was kind of a way of aspiring to kingship. And it was really a sign of treason as well. And then verse 8 says, the words of Ishbaal made Abner very angry, and he said, am I a dog's head for Judah? Today I keep showing loyalty to the house of your father Saul, to his brothers and to his friends, and have not given you into the hand of David, and yet you charge me now with a crime concerning this woman. So Abner doesn't like being accused um, of betraying Saul and even being treasonous. So in verse 9 it says, so may God do to Abner, and so may he add to it. For just as the Lord has sworn to David that I will accomplish for him to transfer the kingdom from the house of Saul and set up the throne of David over Israel and over Judah. So he defects. Abner is going to defect to David. In verse 12, it says, Abner sent messengers to David at Hebron, saying, to whom does the land belong? Make your covenant with me, and I will give you my support to bring all Israel over to you. So he's going to offer here um, Saul's kingdom, and David hears him out, and then David is going to communicate with Ishbaal of Saul, one of Saul's sons, saying, give me my wife Michal, to whom I became engaged at the price of 100 foreskins of the Philistines. And Ishbaal sent and took her from her husband Paltiel, but her husband went with her weeping as he walked behind her all the way. So then Abner said, go back home. So he went back. So David is trying to get his wife back, and Abner has them turn around and go back to Saul. So now finally, Abner is going to come to David, and he's going to offer to be on David's side. And um, now Joab is going to enter into the picture. When you jump down to verse 22, it says, just then the servants of David arrived with Joab from a raid, bringing much spoil with them. But Abner was not with David at Hebron, for David had dismissed him and he'd gone away in peace. When Joab and all the army that was with him came, it was told Joab, Abner, the son of Ner, came to the king, and he has dismissed him, and he has gone away in peace. Then Joab went to the king and said, what have you done? Abner came to you. Why did you dismiss him so that he got away? In other words, Joab is insightful. He thinks that Abner is spying on David. It says in verse 25, you know that Abner, son of Ner, came to deceive you and to learn your comings and goings and to learn all that you are doing. So Joab is appalled at David's actions of entering into dialogue with Abner and then sending Abner back in peace. Now, what happens is interesting. Verse 26, when Joab came out from David's presence, he sent messengers after Abner, and they brought him back from the cistern of Sirah. But David did not know about it. And when Abner returned to Hebron, Joab took him aside in the gateway to speak with him privately, and there he stabbed him in the stomach. And so he died for shedding the blood of Asahel, Joab's brother. Now we're given the true motivation of Joab. This is revenge because Abner had killed Joab's brother. But Joab also sees him as a threat because Abner is possibly a spy that's taking information back to Saul. So you can see here in these stories, this is like Game of Thrones type stuff. I mean, everybody's suspecting everybody, and there is a lot of bloodshed in the process. So we move on from that. So he kills Abner. Now, if you remember, Absalom, David's son, is in exile. Why? He had killed his half brother, Amnon, who had slept with his sister Tamar. And David's David doesn't do anything to hold Absalom accountable. And what we find is Absalom has at heart a desire to overthrow David's kingdom. And Joab knows that. And Joab is willing to get the situation resolved. But while Absalom is in exile, of course, David is not doing anything as a result of that. And what we find is there's this story in chapter 14. So it seems as though Joab puts this woman, she's called the woman of Tekoa, to come and talk to David. It says in chapter 14, verse 1 and 2. Now, Joab perceived that the king's mind was on Absalom. Joab sent to Tekoa and brought from there a wise woman. And he said to her, pretend to be a mourner. Put on mourning garments. Do not anoint yourself with oil, but behave like a woman who has been mourning many days for the dead. Go to the king and speak to him as follows. And Joab put the words into her mouth. Now you got to skip down in chapter 14, and here's what the woman says. Verse 9. The woman of Tekoa said to the king, on me be the guilt. May my lord the king, and on my father's house, let the king and his throne be guiltless. The king says, if anyone says anything to you, bring him to me, and he shall never touch you again. Then she said, please, may the king keep the Lord your God in mind, so that the avenger of blood may kill no more, and my son not be destroyed. He said, as the Lord lives, not one hair of your son shall fall to the ground. Now, what happened, and I skipped over this paragraph, this woman says she has two sons, and one of her sons kills the other son. And uh, revenge is at the heart of this story, but the woman is pleading that the other son not be killed for the sake of the legacy of the family, and for her to have someone to continue to carry on the family and the father's line. And this story is really a setup for David to get Absalom to come back to him. So Joab is working this out in such a way to use this story, much like Nathan did after David had committed adultery with Bathsheba. You remember Nathan came and told a story, a parable, and David got all mad that someone who had a bunch of sheep would take the one sheep of a poor person. Well, this is trying to get David to act as well. And what Joab wants is for Absalom to return. Absalom has been in exile. So what happens is um, David sees through the scheme here. In verse 18, it says, "Then the king answered the woman, 'Do not withhold from me anything I ask you.' The woman said, 'Let my lord the king speak.' The king said, 'Is this the hand of Joab with you in all of this?' In other words, who put you up to this?" And it was Joab. So David finally agrees, and Absalom will return home. And yet, what we're told in the ensuing verses is that even though David allowed him to come back to the city, David refused to see Absalom personally, face to face, for 2 years. So Absalom's back, but he's really not back. He's still in exile. And Joab, we're trying to figure out here, what is his angle in all of this? Well, I think he doesn't have a practical reason for David and Absalom to reconcile. However, I think Joab, while still being loyal to David, understands that Absalom is gaining popularity, and this could be a potential threat down the line for people that are willing to follow Absalom's rule. And with that, I think Joab's looking after his own skin. Where will I be? If Absalom actually overthrows David, then am I going to be killed? So you have to kind of think along the line of Joab playing both sides at the same time. Now, this is an insight that is based upon what he observes Absalom doing. Absalom's making a bunch of political maneuvers. And Absalom is going to win the heart of the people because he's willing to hear the cases, and complaints of the people in the public square. And it's really kind of political grandstanding on the part of Absalom. And he will go back to Hebron, just like what David escaped to Hebron when he was fleeing from Saul. And it is in Hebron that Absalom's going to declare himself to be a king. Now, he does something very vile. David has a harem of women, and Absalom brings all these women into public view, and he rapes them. And it's a way of desecrating David's concubines and showing the rest of the people in Jerusalem that he is taking David's throne and taking David's concubines. Meanwhile, David has some spies that he sends out, and these spies are going to give some bad advice to Absalom. And the reason David does it is to kind of track Absalom's movements. So now David is going to have to engage Absalom's army, and as a result of that, it comes to a head, and that's in chapter 18. So I've summarized for you several different chapters of what's going on in the meantime. But when you get to chapter 18, it says in verse 1, David mustered the men who were with him and set over them commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds. And David divided the army into three groups, one under the command of Joab, one under the command of Abishai, and one third under the command of Ittai. So divides these up, and what we find is there's a battle in the forest of Ephraim that's going to take place. And what we find taking place is David is his army is much more skilled than Absalom's army. But Joab has been told that he is not to harm Absalom. So they engage in battle. And we're told in verse 6, so the army went out into the field against Israel, and the battle was fought in the forest of Ephraim. And the men of Israel were defeated there by the servants of David, and the slaughter there was great on that day, 20,000 men. The battle spread over the face of all the country, and the forest claimed more victims that day than the sword. Then it says Absalom happened to meet the servants of David. Absalom was riding on his mule, and the mule went under the thick branches of a great oak. His head caught fast in the oak and was left hanging between heaven and earth, while the mule that was under him went on. A man saw it, so he sees Absalom hanging there and tells Joab, I saw Absalom hanging in an oak. And Joab said to the man, what, you saw him? Why did you not strike him down to the ground? And then the guy's going to say, I'm not going to raise my hand against the king's son. Are you crazy? David will have me killed. And so Joab in verse 14 didn't waste any time, it says. I will not waste my time with this. He took 3 spears in his hand, thrust them into the heart of Absalom while he was still alive in the oak. And then 10 young men, Joab's armor bearers, surrounded Absalom, struck him, and killed him. Verse 17 says they threw him into a great pit in the forest and threw a heap of stones upon him. Now notice here, Joab has the best in mind for David's kingdom. However, he does not keep in mind David's heart, and he ignores that. He has been told to be kind to Absalom. He ends up killing him. So here's what we see about Joab. He's very loyal to the kingdom and to David's reign. But he is an individual that will do what he has to do. And what we find is that he kills Absalom. Chapter 19 tells us that David goes into full throttle grief. And if you come to chapter 19, it says in verse 1, the king is weeping and mourning for Absalom. Of course, it was his son. But then notice if you come down to verse 5 in chapter 19, it says, then Joab came into the house to the king and said, today you have covered with shame the faces of all your officers who have saved your life today, and the lives of your sons and your daughters, and the lives of your wives and concubines, for the love of those who hate you, and for hatred of those who love you. You have made it clear today that commanders and officers are nothing to you. In other words, you didn't keep in mind, by showing this grief over your son, you didn't care about the sacrifice that all these people did to keep you in power and to keep you safe. So here's what we find is in chapter 18, Joab says basically Absalom must be eliminated. That's just the bottom line. He kills him. And then he actually confronts David, and what we find is that he really does give to David a scolding. Then when you get down to the bottom of chapter 19, here's the other person that we're introduced to that Joab is going to kill. It says in verse 11, King David sent this message to the priests Zadok and Abiathar. Say to the elders of Judah, why should you be the last to bring the king back to his house? The talk of all Israel has come to the king. You are my kin, you are my bone and flesh. Why then should you be the last to bring back the king? And say to Amasa, are you not my bone and flesh? So may God do to me and more, if you are not the commander of my army from now on in place of Joab. See what just happened? Because Joab killed Absalom, Now Joab is no longer the commander of the army. He has been replaced by this guy by the name of Amasa. Verse 14. Amasa swayed the hearts of all the people of Judah as one, and they sent word to the king. So Amasa is going to obviously talk trash about Joab, right? And so here's what happens. Joab is going to get Amasa out of the way, basically. So Amasa is going to lead David's army, but Joab's not going to have any of it. And what happens in verses 8 through 10 of chapter 20 is this. It says, the king got up, took his seat in the gate. The troops were all told, see, the king is sitting in the gate. All the troops came before the king. Meanwhile, all the Israelites had fled to their homes, and all the people were disputing throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, the king delivered us from the hands of our enemies and saved us from the hand of the Philistines, and now he is fled out of the land because of Absalom. But Absalom, whom we anointed over us, is dead in battle. Now, therefore, why do you say nothing about bringing the king back? And it says, King David sent this message to the priests, and so forth. Amasa is going to build up the situation, saying David should come back and be king. And what we find is that that there is this moment in time where um, uh, Joab is going to murder Amasa, and he will also confront another enemy by the name of Sheba, which is down in verses 14 and 15. So this text is moving all over the place. In chapter 19, um, Saul has a grandson by the name of Mephibosheth, who's a cripple. When his family is going to be wiped out, David shows mercy to Mephibosheth and doesn't kill him. In chapter 20, Sheba is going to be an individual and that people are going to begin to follow as well. It's a mess. But by the time you get to the end of chapter 20, we're told how Joab gets Amasa out of the way. It says down in verse 9, there's this conversation that's going on. Joab said to Amasa, is it well with you, my brother? And Joab took Amasa by the beard with his right hand to kiss him. But Amasa did not notice the sword in Joab's hand, and Joab struck him in the belly so that his entrails poured out on the ground, and he died. He did not strike a second blow. In other words, he killed him. And then he goes on and he pursues this other enemy by the name of Sheba. And finally, Joab, we're told at the end of the chapter, was in command of all the army of Israel. So he gets his position back. So I know this is a lot. The one thing that he does is he's trying to keep his position. He's trying to keep David on the throne. And then we're told in chapter 24, the one thing that he does do is he speaks truth to David. Now, David, by this time, he's had so many people that have been, treasonous toward him that I think he has some self-doubt about his reign. And we're told in chapter 24, and you can read it on your own, that David wants to take a census of the people, and Joab is going to straightforwardly tell him that's not a good idea. Now, here's what's interesting. Notice in verse 1 of chapter 24, it says, again, the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel and incited David against them, saying, go count the people of Israel and Judah. Now, why would David want to take a census? Well, obviously, the census is what produces the type of things that determine taxation, military service, further labor for building projects in the kingdom, that type of thing. Now, notice here, though, it says the Lord kind of incited David to count the people. And so the king said to Joab and the commanders of the army who were with him, go through all the tribes of Israel and takes a census of the people. Now, that didn't sit real well with the editors of First and Second Chronicles. And if you were to look at a parallel passage of the census of David in First Chronicles, it's interesting that First Chronicles 21 substitutes the name Satan for the Lord. That Satan is the one that incited David to take a census. Now, notice what not David, notice what Joab says about the census in verse 4 here. It says, but the king's words prevailed against Joab and the commanders of the army. So Joab and the commanders of the army went out from the presence of the king to take a census of the people. In verse 3, I jumped over that. But Joab said to the king, may the Lord your God increase the number of the people a hundredfold, while the eyes of my lord the king can still see it. But why does my king want to do this? What's the purpose of the census? Well, the census, like I mentioned before, will determine taxes, will determine servants, and will determine military. It seems to me that David's trying to secure his legacy in all of this. Now, he has lost 3 sons at this point. So he has lost Absalom, he has lost Amnon, whom Absalom killed. And then, if you remember, after the baby was born that Bathsheba was pregnant with, the infant died. And there appears to be no heir to the throne. And so I think he's feeling very insecure about all this. And in some ways, his kingdom is kind of like his substitute child. And he's nearing the end of his life. And how is he going to console himself? Well, Joab says this is not a good idea of taking a census. So Joab is trying to tell us that it's not a good idea, but he does what David wants him to do. It says here in verse 9, it says, Joab reported to the king the number of those who had been recorded in Israel. There were 800,000 soldiers able to draw the sword, and those of Judah were 500,000. Those numbers are impossible. Okay. That's propaganda. Okay. All politics use propaganda. Why do I say that? Um, Most scholars know that this number of 1,000, I mean, not 1,000, over 1 million fighting men is actually greater than the population of the entire area, according to archaeology, and the numbers don't add up. So here's a quick insight. When you look at numbers in the Bible, you just understand that they're a bit wonky, okay? That there's other motivations for the reason they're added the way they are. Most of the time, it's for political propaganda. Um, most of the numbers are out of line. And if you can kind of keep that in mind and remember, the tendency is to say, well, no, all of it has to be right because the Bible is inspired and it's without error. Bible is written by people and people have motivations. And one of the motivations here is to make David look strong. And so the number comes back. And in many ways, this is really all First and Second Samuel has been trying to really stabilize in the eyes of the kingdom that David really was the one that was chosen to be the best king. And and you find that there is all of this propaganda that is often used to either dismiss things that saying David didn't do them, or it's somebody else's fault, or there were people that didn't listen to David. There's just a lot that's going on here. So what is David going to do? We don't know exactly what's going to happen until we see the final episode of Joab, and it's not in Second Samuel. It's actually in First and Kings chapters 1 and 2. So David is nearing the end of his life. His health is failing, and he is yet to declare a successor. His oldest son at this time, Abijah, will declare himself to be the king. And Joab is going to support that. And it just makes sense. He's the one that's in line. If you look at chapter 1, verse 5, it says, Adonijah, the son of Haggith, exalted himself, saying, I will be king. And he prepared for himself chariots and horsemen and 50 men to run before him. His father had never at any time displeased him by asking, Why have you done thus and so? Um, he also was a very handsome man, it says, and he was born next after Absalom. So again, we're seeing this story repeat itself. He looks the part, and because he looks the part, he claims the crown, and he makes a sacrifice. And here's what happens: Joab is going to um, realize that there are some things that are happening here that he eventually can't control. Because Bathsheba is going to persuade David to endorse Solomon to be the king. Now, who's Solomon? That's the son of Bathsheba and David. And if you look at this, then there's going to be a new regime under Solomon. And in chapter 2 of First Kings, you find out that there's a new general over the army. His name is Benaiah. And in chapter 2, verse 28, he is going to be the one that is taking over. And verse 28 of chapter 2 says, When the news came to Joab, for Joab had supported Adonijah, though he had not supported Absalom, Joab fled to the tent of the Lord and grasped the horns of the altar. He thinks that he's safe. He thinks he has found sanctuary by going to the place of the altar. And when it was told King Solomon, Joab had fled to the tent of the Lord and is now beside the altar, Solomon sent Benaiah, told him, Go strike him down. So Benaiah came to the tent of the Lord and said to him, The king commands, come out. But he said, No, I will die here. Then Benaiah brought the king word again, saying, Thus said Joab, and thus he answered me. The king replied to him, Do as he has said, strike him down and bury him, and thus take away from me and from my father's house the guilt for the blood that Joab shed without cause. So Solomon is basically going to get rid of Joab. Joab's a threat. But one of the things that we will find is that through this whole story of First and Second Samuel, First and Second Kings, the war machine continues to go on. And, you know, a lot of people, when they read the Old Testament, are quite concerned that there's so much bloodshed. And it appears as though God is the one that's commanding all of this. I think what's best to understand here is this. The bloodshed that's in the Old Testament reflects more the hearts of men than it does the heart of God. And you have to understand that this is all set within a context where war is all the time. And again, I mentioned earlier, it's kind of like Game of Thrones. I mean, it's just one threat being eliminated after another. So here we find upon the coming death of David, Solomon is going to eliminate his rivals as well. And that legacy will continue on. What we're going to find is it's going to continue through First and Second Kings after Solomon's off the throne, and after the kingdom splits in two between Judah and Israel, and they have their own kings. Warfare continues on and on. Okay, so quite a fascinating story. This guy by the name of Joab, and he really does reflect, maybe even more so than all of the others, a lot of the political leaders that we see taking much of the press today. You know, we're invading different countries. We're paying for a genocide. The war machine just continues to go on and on. It's been doing so for thousands of years because of the hearts of men that are so corrupt, wanting power, wanting prestige, wanting profit, all that type of thing. So let me stop our recording, and we'll discuss if you have any questions or thoughts that you have at this point.